One time I was speaking to somebody about it, and they said I haven't murdered anybody, and I don't rob anybody, so why shouldn't I go to heaven?
There you go, see?
Yeah. And that was
It's interesting, people's idea of heaven is that they deserve it, and God's going to let them in, not in God's terms, but in their terms. I'm just so nice, you know, God's going to let me into heaven.
Yeah.
If that was the case, Jesus died for nothing. What did Jesus die for?
I once spoke to a lady in Tunbridge Wells. She said, "Me, a sinner, the very idea is ridiculous."
And 9 times out of 10, when we're talking to family members, somebody you know can be a really nice person, all right? And as we're talking to them and saying, they say, yeah, I'm a really nice person. And the first thing you can say to them is, let me meet your wife. Let me talk to your children. And they'll tell me how nice you are, No way. Okay. Objective: to understand the process of sin as shown in James 1:13-15 and examine our reactions towards temptation. At the centre of all man's trouble is sin. At the centre of sin is I, and sin is doing what I want instead of what God intended me to do. It's rebellion ultimately against God. We're going to look at it later, but David, when he he committed adultery, and then he committed murder to be able to build on that. When he was forced to face up to it, he said, I have sinned against God. And ultimately, that's what we need to recognize. At the end of the day, our sin ultimately is against God. Whoever else who sinned against, God's involved, because we're all God's creatures. And so therefore, that's part of the thing. Remember, when somebody wants to do wrong, it's never God who is tempting him, for God never wants you to do wrong. I should throw you in there. And never tempts anyone else to do it. Okay, so that's a distinction. We're going to see the difference between God testing somebody and God tempting somebody. Whatever God tests us is to help us to understand how strong we are and how strong we can be. Whenever the devil tempts us, it is to make sure that we see our weaknesses and drags us down as far as we can go. So there's a vast distinction between what the devil does and what God does. God's looking for our best, the devil's looking for our worst. Everyone is put to test by being attracted and seduced by that person's own wrong desires. At the end of the day, we want something, we see something, and we want to be involved in something, and therefore we plan how to make that happen. Sometimes it's different, we're in the wrong place at the wrong time and just wrong things happen. But a lot of the time we actually plan it because of what we're attracted to. So sin and evil, who can answer? The agnostic. What does the agnostic say about sin? What does the atheist or the naturalist say about sin? What does the pantheist or New Age person say about sin? We've all got a different, if you ask them these questions, what would they answer? Why ask the agnostic? I can't know, I don't know anything about sin. I don't even believe there is such a thing as sin. Who are you asking if there's no one to ask? If there is no God, what am I sinning against? What question? They don't believe in sin. Sin to them, or evil, is not real, or is real. Is it real? They don't believe sin is real. The theist, on the other hand, if God exists, the question is a valid question. The theist, as the person who believes in God, can offer some valid answers. They believe that God does have inside of us what is a conscience that helps us to understand. Muslims believe that suffering is due to God. Anything that happens, it's the will of God, it's the will of Allah. If you're suffering, that's what God wants you to go through. And so their attitude towards sin and suffering is totally different from the Christian's perspective. It's all God's fault. Hindus, by contrast, will tell you your suffering is not so much God's fault. You're suffering because of something you did. Whatever, you must have done something really bad before, and that's why you're suffering now. How can Jesus help us? Jesus claims that there's only one way to God. John 14:6 says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one can come to the Father except through me. Now, we're sometimes laughed at, and sometimes we're eyes are too narrow. You're far too strong in your religious belief and what the things you say. Well, the problem is, Jesus is our example. I can't say to you, it doesn't matter, there's a big football stadium, there's lots of doors all the way around it, and all the doors lead back to God. I can't say that, because Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father except through me. So he says, and if you understand what's going on, he says, I'm the door that you need to enter in through. And if you don't understand, then you're in bad trouble. And we're being a bit arrogant, and we're a bit exclusive. You guys, you know, that's a bit harsh, isn't it? Well, Jesus said it. I can't do anything about that. He's God in the flesh. That's what he said. I can only say what he said. And I don't say it in an arrogant manner. I'm not saying it because I think I'm better than you. I'm saying it because that's what Jesus said, and I'm going to tell you what Jesus said. So I'm stuck with it. I would like to change it. Christ's claims and proof of claims are totally unique compared to any other major religions. Buddha, he claimed to point the way. Muhammad claimed to be a prophet of God. Jesus Christ is the only major religious leader that ever claimed to be God, who fulfilled prophecy, lived a sinless life, then died on the cross and rose from the dead. You can go to the tomb of Muhammad and Buddha and all these people. They died when they never rose again. They didn't claim to be from God, though Muhammad claimed to be a prophet of God. Jesus was more than just a prophet. Jesus was God in the flesh. And he demonstrated that by the power of his resurrection from the dead. Some people say Christianity is too exclusive. You've got to think about the times in which we live. You know, okay, 2,000 years ago, it was okay to say, you're a sinner, and you're a saint, you're a sinner, and you need to get back to God. It's okay. I was okay for years ago. You could say that type of thing. But we're modern people. We're living in a modern age. We can't go around telling people they're wrong. We can't go around telling people they're sinners. You can't go around telling people that you know the way to God. Okay, it's wrong, you see. We live in a time when angry voices demand we shouldn't consider people as lost. How can you tell people today, in this 20th century, that they're lost in sin just because they aren't Christians? That's a non-Christian thing to do, isn't it? That's not very Christian of you to say that I'm not a Christian. It's not a very Christian thing to say that I'm lost because I don't believe in you, Jesus. That's not very. No, this is the 20th century. When are you going to wake up? Okay, so it's the same really. Okay, let's say that you're lost in the desert and it's getting dark. Furthermore, you're hungry, you're thirsty, and you know down deep inside, if you don't find food and shelter soon, you're probably going to die. So it's a bleak-looking prospect, okay? Then you see a speck of light on the horizon indicating there's a human life out there. Instead of moving towards the light, you move away from it. So whose fault is it if ultimately you die in the darkness? Why is it our fault? We saw the light that indicated there was somebody there who might be able to help us, but instead we chose to go away from the light. Now we've made a choice. The light was there, the opportunity was there, and we turned our back on it and we walked away from it. So can we really then turn around and say, well, it's a guy with a lamp's fault. He should have come to find me. He should have been, he should have shouted more at me. He should have encouraged me. What? You saw the light. Why didn't you go to the light? If we had chosen to move towards the light, wouldn't the light have grown a bit brighter? Wouldn't it have revealed who was there, friend or foe? In a similar way, God is not responsible for giving us greater light of who He is if we haven't responded to the light that He's already revealed through the general revelation. God has shown the light. How many of these, we see it all the time in some of these science programs, they're talking about something that's absolutely mind-blowing in its intricacy and its detail, and then they think it just happened. Even though there's no way it could have just happened. God saved them. Haven't I complex? Look what I've done. Are you amazed? And they say, oh, it just happened. What? Doesn't make sense. As a full illustration of God's blamelessness regarding our choices, we know that the Bible reveals that there will be people in every dialect and from every nation in heaven. God has spoken. People have responded. Not just the Jews. We're proof of that. We're Irish descendants, Scottish descendants, English descendants, and we're all in Christ. There's going to be people from every nation in heaven. Isn't that amazing? And we're one of them. Isn't that even more amazing? Okay? So, it's not as if God hates one particular nation, or God's put a bar on a particular nation. He says, I want to welcome all. All, my son died for all. The whole world he died for. Furthermore, don't you think that if God loves us and demonstrated that he paid the ultimate price in sending Jesus to die in our place, he would be willing to do whatever it took to save us? Hasn't God made the effort? Isn't God wanting to try to help us to understand what it's all about? C.S. Lewis said one of these things, as an atheist, my argument against God was that the universe seemed so cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of what is just and what is unjust? He says, a man doesn't call a line crooked unless he has some idea of what a straight line looks like. So even as an atheist, he said, I was making judgments, but I was just judging those judgments against what I seemed to think was a different, higher standard. He said, and then one day he woke up and realized, well, if there is such a thing as a higher standard, there must be a higher standard maker. So as an atheist, he was making decisions based upon this is a better decision than that. This is a better way to walk than that. This is a better, and then he thinks, well, why? Why is that always a better standard? How am I able to judge anything unless there's some line that I can judge it against? Some truth that I can judge it against. He says, if there were no light in the universe, and therefore no creature with eyes, we would never know that it was dark. Darkness, the concept of darkness, would be totally without meaning. Okay? It's only the very fact that we can see the light, that we recognize when it's dark. That there is an opposite, that we can, a standard which we can measure the level of darkness. People who like looking at the stars, they're totally amazed when they go to places like Manchester or London, because suddenly the same sky they were looking at in Manchester has suddenly taken on a vast, brighter perspective. Why? Because they're away from all they're away from all the light pollution. So now they can see more clearly. And the fact that they can see more clearly, and they've got a standard to weigh it against, they know that Manchester light pollutes the sky so much that it affects what you see. And yet out in the countryside, this is totally dark. And darkness is real. It's touching, it's always tangible. It's frightening because you're so used to the light. Now that you're in the dark, you think, oh, goodness gracious, was that rustling in the bushes? Oh, let's get out of here. You know? Have you ever had the camping experience in the middle of nowhere, in a totally dark night, and you go out and you think, I know there's tent lines around here somewhere, but I can't see a thing. You know? So we make that contrast because we know what daylight looks like, and therefore we recognize the power of darkness.
You do recognise how light is when the sky's clear,
Yes.
and how bright the stars is as well, don't you?
I love some of these programs that go to some of the countries that are in the middle of nowhere, and they show you a scan across the night sky, and you think, goodness, you could grab some of them. They're just right in your face. They're so bright. We don't get that because we've got all this light pollution all around us. And some of these countries seem a bit closer. Don't we measure what is evil by the standard of good, rather than measure good by the standard of evil? You know, we have difficulty in understanding what is wrong and what is right, unless we get our standard sorted out. And that's the problem with your pal, and you know, it's because he doesn't see the real standard, he doesn't realise just how bad an act that was. And it's part of that deal. So if we say something is good or right, why? And that's a real question for the atheist, for the agnostic. Why is what you are doing right or wrong? If you're just an animal, you know, a dog stealing sausages doesn't think it's a real problem. You know, it's just something he does. If he can get away with it, he's quite happy to try and get away with it. And I was beaten to death the week before to tell them that sausages are wrong. But on average, most animals don't understand right and wrong. They just see the opportunities and they take the opportunities available. But we, being human, we have even the worst nature on earth, the worst group of people on earth, whatever you've been on earth, there's always some sort of standard. If you go to a place where they eat people, they're cannibals, all right? They're even within that group, they'll be saying, you're not allowed to eat them. You can eat these, but you're not allowed to eat them. You know, there's that standard. If you go to a gypsy camp, they'll tell you, you're not allowed to steal from your fellow gypsy. Well, break your neck when you steal from your fellow gypsy. But everybody else is fair game. So there's rules, there's standards in every society. And that helps us to recognise there is a right, there is a just, and there is a wrong, there is an unjust. But who decides that we should be just? Or why shouldn't we just do whatever we feel like it? Matter of fact, I've said before, in the 60s and 70s, well, probably in the tail end of the 60s, that used to be a popular sticker. If you feel like it, do it. That's okay if you're doing it to somebody else. But if they feel like it and they're doing it to you, that's not so good. It's a nice standard to have as a catchy phrase, but it doesn't work in real life because we have standards. And if there's a moral law, doesn't that imply that somewhere there's a moral law giver? Somewhere something says this is wrong. And again, across all sorts of cultures and stuff like that, if you see a 90-year-old lady being beaten up in the street for a couple of pounds out of their pocket, I don't care who you are. If you see that in action, you say, that is wrong. Somebody should do something about it. Somebody should pay. You know, it seems to be unless you're actually the one doing the mugging at the time, most people would think along those lines. There's just something wrong about beating up old ladies. You know, it just shouldn't happen. So, an independent standard for measurement is what we need. The moment we say that there's a set of moral ideas that can be better than another set, we are in fact measuring them both by a standard, saying that one of them conforms to that standard more nearly than the other. But a standard that measures two things is something different from either. So every society has certain standards that are acceptable and certain standards that are not. But God's standard is outside of society. It's not society determine the standards that always are right, because sometimes society decides the weirdest stuff, the worst stuff, but God's outside. So the answer to the cause of evil and sin, it's God's fault, somebody says. If I'm like I am, then surely it's God's fault. If He made me, then it's His fault at the end of the day, okay? God made everything perfect. And one of the perfect things that God made was free creatures. That was His biggest mistake. He made us with a free will. In other words, He allows us to make choices. And I don't know about you in your experience in life, but I know in my experience in life, I've made some dodgy choices. Okay? And they've been bad. They weren't bad choices at the time as far as I was concerned. I was making the right choices. It was only when you look back on them you realise those weren't the right choices to make, because it had horrible implications. But it seemed right at the time. Free will is the cause of sin and evil. Genesis 3 verse 6. Therefore, imperfection, evil can arise from the perfect, not directly but indirectly, through freedom. If we are given choices, then unfortunately, some of our choices will be wrong choices. God created the fact of freedom. Man performs the acts of freedom. God made sin and evil possible. We make it actual. Okay? We make the wrong choices, and that becomes the real problem. Now, one of the other things that you hear all the time from people is, if God is so big and great and perfect and loving, why doesn't He do something about the suffering of the world? Why doesn't He do something about the suffering in my life? If God is so big and fancy and all the things that Christians claim Him to be, why doesn't He do something when things are going wrong? Okay? Here's a guy, he's on the edge of falling off a roof. Well, why didn't God stop him? Why couldn't God, when he's just at that stage, he's accidentally come too close to the edge, lost his balance, just about to go, and a big hand comes down from the sky and says, oh, gotcha! Okay, puts him back in the roof.
What's he doing in the roof in the first place?
Maybe he shouldn't be up in the roof. Maybe he fixed the roof, right? Give him the benefit of that being there for the right reasons. He's not trying to rob them, okay? You know, God could step in and grab him. God can, but He won't. Why? Because His directed intervention to stop sin and evil also requires that He suspends our freedom. If we were to go up and play on the edge of a roof, and if we lose our balance, that's our choice. You know, if He stops us, you know, as soon as that guy went anywhere near the roof, God just said, hey, put a block in front of him, stop them going up there. Okay? That would have prevented him. That would have taken away his freedom to go up on the roof. But it would have saved his life.
I think there's a more dramatic example. A child stepping out into the road in a car, isn't it?
You know, that's one of the, sometimes when we talk about parental responsibility, and it's not a good subject because it's one of those dodgy subjects that people get into all sorts of trouble over, okay? But there is an element, I think you did this once with the dog. And it's a real thing, okay? And you can understand it, alright? When we say to our children, now don't do that, or stop that, or whatever, and because they say to us, is this a real don't? Is this a real stop? Or is it one of those things, well, it doesn't really matter, I can do it anyway. And they're saying, you know, they make all this logical stuff to push the boundaries out. Is this a real stop or not? If we don't help our children to know stop means stop, the real danger comes when they're going along the side of the road. When you see them playing in their own little world, and then suddenly you see a car coming up and you see them, and you know, everything just slows down. Your whole mind just slows down, and you can see it clear as day. He's going to turn, and he's going to drop that ball, and he's going to bounce out the road, and he's going to go chasing out it, and bang, the car's going to stop. If we haven't trained our kids to say, when I say stop, whatever happens, don't even think about it. You stop because I'm saying it for a reason, then that child will just ignore it and go off. And that's the real problem with parenting, okay? So trying to get that balance right. So there are certain inflexes of our voice, there are certain things that we do that a child knows instinctively, I better not move because Dad knows best, Mum knows best in this situation. And I know if I continue, I'm going to be in trouble. Okay, so there needs to be that element in your voice, or element in your fabric of your being, that a child recognises that this is important. All the rest may be fun. This is important, and by doing so, it will save their lives. In Bruce Almighty, I don't know whether you ever saw the film, but anyway, God woos us without violating our freedom. God doesn't want to step in and order us to do all sorts of stuff, but He tries to help us to realise this is in your best interest. That's not in your best interest. Down the road, this is the better decision. That's not so good decision. At the end of the day, how do I make someone love me without violating their free will? That's God's problem. How do I help people to love me and do what's right in their lives without breaking their free will? Have you ever tried to do something you knew was wrong? The Bible calls those wrong actions at the end of the day sin. In a general sense, sin means that when God gives us a law or a commandment and we refuse to do it, this makes us without law or lawless. Whoever commits sin commits lawlessness, and sin is lawlessness, 1 John chapter 3 verse 4 says. Breaking or violating of God's law is ultimately what we call sin. Lawlessness is a Greek word, anomia, and it means without law. Everyone who commits, practices sin is guilty of lawlessness, of breaking a law, for that's where sin is. The breaking and violating ultimately of God's law by transgression or neglect, being unrestrained and unregulated by His commandments and His will. Doing our own thing, doing what we want to do, not caring about anybody else, not caring about God ultimately, and that's the idea. We see this passage teaches that sin is a personal refusal to be governed by God's divine will and setting up a will against God's will. I don't care who God is, I'm going to do what I'm going to do. John 1:8 says, if we say we are without sin, he said, we deceive ourselves. The truth is not in us. If we say we have not sinned, we make God a liar, and His word is not in us. He says sin is a reality. You know, you may think you're perfect, you may think you're not a bad person, but at the end of the day, every one of us, at some point in our lives, has committed sin, and therefore that makes us